The proceeding will begin. And thank you for coming to the session with Ambassador Dobriansky. It's a very rare opportunity to have her with us. And before we go any further, David, are you there? David
Yes, I'm here.
Lee?
Yep.
Go ahead.
All right.
Introduce the ambassador.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I have the privilege of introducing Ambassador Paula J. Dobriansky. Ambassador Dobriansky is a foreign policy expert with over 30 years of experience in diplomacy, business, and defense. She's the vice chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center. Previously, she has served as senior vice president at Thomson Reuters, Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, and as President's Envoy to Northern Ireland, earning the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Medal. She's held roles in the Reagan administration, including Director of European and Soviet Affairs on the National Security Council. She's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and the American Academy of Diplomacy, and chairs Exim Bank's Council on China Competition. She holds a BSFS summa cum laude from Georgetown University, an MA and PhD from Harvard, and has received international honors and 5 honorary degrees. Ladies and gentlemen, please, Ambassador Dobriansky.
Thank you, David. Ambassador, it's all yours, Paula.
All right. Well, thank you first. Thank you, David, for that introduction. And Dr. Kim, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here before ICAS and its members. And as we were discussing prior to just the opening here, you know, there's just a lot happening in the world. So it's very timely to do a kind of tour de horizon and to focus on the Indo-Pacific, at the same time to look at the transatlantic. And also, well, we've added in the Middle East in this as well. In my opening comments, I'd like to make a number of points. And let me begin first by saying that there have been some very striking, I would say, shifts in geopolitical trends. And I would begin with this. We know that this era has been cast as one of great power competition. I think it is worth taking stock of the Russia-China relationship, because traditionally that relationship has been one which usually there have been tensions. And we've seen where the relationship has really been apart for a significant period of time. In this period, I would say that not only do we see great power competition with China and Russia being aligned, but why is it aligned? It's aligned because it has common goals, common objectives. The first being that it does seek to diminish U.S. power and influence globally. And secondly, it also seeks to target U.S. allies, partners, friends, and to try to pose a kind of fragmentation. And we especially see that in the European arena. So the first is this point that great power competition is, I think, here to stay for a while. I don't see a shift or a change in the near term, or even, I would say, the medium term. I think it's going to be with us for a while. Secondly, I think it's also worth noting that not only what brings both Russia and China together, but stepping back and looking at the specifics of the relationship. First, in the energy space, and I picked that out because it was a number of years ago, not recently, Russia actually looked to China after decades of negotiating a pipeline deal. And the Russians didn't like the terms of that pipeline deal, but the Russians came forward and actually concluded this pipeline deal with the Chinese. And it was to their disadvantage. So to me, that was a striking message, a message also when one looked at the energy constraints that were imposed on Russia in the European arena, in particular, the ultimate withdrawal from Nord Stream 2, the cutoff, and also the look at other kinds of energy paths forward, like, for example, I'm only giving one. There's the 3Cs initiative, which Poland and Croatia launched, and in which they've looked at other kinds of energy supplies, including LNG from the United States. So one is we look at energy, you look at trade, and in terms of the volume of trade, certainly Russia has increased its trade and a volume of its trade into China. China has also been at an advantage from the Russian marketplace as well. But that aspect of the relationship has shifted. Thirdly is, in recent time, we've also seen a number of military exercises that have taken place. Military exercises which had not heretofore, when I say heretofore, I'm not talking about the past decade, but before that, where really Russia and China were not aligned in that context militarily. So much so that even when one looks at what both countries are doing in the Arctic, I would say that there's a kind of a threat that is posed in terms of the kind of military or militarization, if you will, not just only commercial competition, but also military kind of advancement, which also poses a particular threat. One needs to only look at the context in which Putin and also Xi Jinping have met. When you look at meetings between past Russian and Chinese leaders, it's not the same. I think the number, I've lost count, but I know that it's at least over 45 meetings in terms of which they've come together to discuss a wide range of issues, including, of course, Russia's appeals to China for support in its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, and in which we know that despite Chinese protestations and statements that it has not provided Russia with any kind of military assistance, we now know that's been exposed recently, and in which China has stepped forward and not just been on the sidelines, but has provided such assistance to Russia. So my first is, it's an era of great power competition. And secondly, I think we have to have this backdrop, and the backdrop of the kind of enhanced Russia-China relationship, and what that means just not only for the European or transatlantic arena, the Middle Eastern arena, but also certainly that of the Indo-Pacific. And I would say that it is concerning, very concerning in terms of political, economic, and military developments. Let me go to a second, or really a third broader point. And the broader point is, I know a question that has arisen quite often. And actually, in this case, I relish the opportunity to speak before ICAS, because when I speak before the European audience, if you will, we do talk about the kinds of threats relative to the Indo-Pacific. But here, I want to focus on, in particular, statements that have been made actually out of the region, meaning the Indo-Pacific, and the concern about the developments occurring in Europe, in particular, Ukraine. The Japanese Prime Minister, Kishida, who will be stepping down if he has not already stepped down, the timetable, and I could be corrected on this call as to that timetable, but I want to cite the fact that over last year and even up to earlier this year, his statements, I think his statements were significant. He spoke before the Johns Hopkins SAIS University, and then also had the advantage, I'm going to say, for him and for us, of speaking before our Congress. I thought the message was a very potent one, that these two arenas are not disconnected. And as he said, what happens in Ukraine? If Ukraine is successful in getting the Russian troops off of its territory and securing its sovereign territory back, meaning the Donbass area, but also not just only the Donbass, but also it's very important in this case. It's very important also in this case, not just only the Donbass, but also Crimea. So in this case, why is this relevant? It's very relevant because, as the Prime Minister had stated, that what happens if there's success in pushing back, that is important for the Indo-Pacific and Chinese intentions, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan. If Ukraine does not succeed, and whatever unfolds here, it will have consequences. And I think he was quite right to point it out. And I think it was also significant that he, more than an American or European, stated that, because there has been great concern about China's intentions relative to Taiwan. They've been stated very clearly by Xi Jinping in this case. And quite frankly, Taiwanese are, in my view, are very cognizant of this threat and also have prepared themselves for this threat. What do I mean by that? I visited Taiwan last year, and this was prior to the elections, and I was very struck by the focus on what one would cast as various kinds of scenarios, not just necessarily a military invasion, but also, as I know all of you know, there's been talk of a blockade. There's been talk of, for the period of 2027, of various scenarios. The fact is, though, and why I raise this crucial point, both of these arenas geopolitically are very much interrelated. They can't be divorced. And the Prime Minister Kishida, was very correct in saying that what happens in one will definitely affect the other. I think this is crucial as we go forward, because one also looks at the issue of alliances. And I want to say just a word, also about that. Alliances matter. And I think that we have seen first, interestingly enough, in Europe, we certainly have seen the expansion. Ironically, the expansion. That was not something I think that Putin was seeking to witness. But the expansion of the NATO alliance, Finland, Sweden, if you had asked me in my lifetime, would I have seen that occur? I would not have necessarily said a firm and resounding yes. But we've witnessed that, and we've also witnessed in that regard also an enhanced capability in terms of the alliance. To me, it's also very striking. We've witnessed Poland step forward. Its defense budget is 4.7%, very significant. Greece also has a very strong, I believe it's also almost, believe 4. I think it was like 3.9, but virtually up to 4. But the fact of the matter is that many of the countries are moving forward. And why? Because they're very concerned about a future threat and what it means with this unprovoked aggression, and that it can also mean unprovoked aggression in terms of their own respective territories, the Baltics, and certainly Poland on the front lines. So here you have the NATO alliance. And then you have, by the way, there are many countries that also are NATO non-members, and a number of which are also, well, around the globe. But let me go to also quite significantly alliances that have come up in the Indo-Pacific. There's always the question in the United States, will there be a NATO alliance in the Indo-Pacific? I'm not so sure that that is crucial or necessary. Why? Because there are some very key alliances that are in existence. Certainly, we have AUKUS, which is a very crucial alliance. We have the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, initiated by AMB, 2007, and then right up to the present time, the United States, India, Australia, and Japan. And in this, you have the Malabar exercises. But let me also add, I think we witnessed something very significant during the pandemic. And that was, there was around the Quad also a kind of economic alliance. Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand came into the forefront and were engaged with the Quad members and what we call sort of Quad Plus of looking at supply chains and how one could deal also economically. It's not just only about military strength, but it is also about a strong economic foundation and survivability, and where supply chains are not impacted. So I wanted to mention that. There's also, of course, the relationship of the United States, Japan, Australia. Australia has also an interesting alliance with Indonesia and India. I could go on. And also, recently, as we know, I believe it was last year, if my timing is correct, where Korea, Japan, the United States, very historic meeting in Washington, D.C. So I think that this is another aspect of geopolitics that is important to put on the table, is that countries are aligning in different ways to protect their political, economic, and military interests. And then let me in this case, and then also let me in this case mention just a few last points. I indicated that I would speak for about 15, 20 minutes at the opening and put some points forward. So let me also just mention a few last points in closing. In terms of China itself, you certainly have a China threat. I think it is worth noting, and I wanted to be precise on this, it was the first time in 44 years, by the way, that China literally conducted an ICBM, flight, a flight of an ICBM over the Pacific. Very striking. What does that mean? It's a provocation. It's certainly a provocation. I think all of us have been witnessing that term is well used, the rise of China, but you look at it in many sectors. In this case, the nuclear sector, you look at it in terms of the Navy, the bolstering of the Navy, you look at it across the board. So it's not only about the South China Seas, and yes, it is, but it even goes beyond that. And also, I mentioned at the beginning about great power competition. We see BRICS. We see also the issue of One Belt, One Road. We see basically it's not only about military power, but also about economic strength and economic outreach and engagement. In terms of North Korea, I'm going to say this. I look forward to comments in this session. There are those of you who are really experts. I'm not an expert on North Korea, but all I can say is something that is very striking to me. It's a reflection about the past. When I was in government, I remember we had six-party talks, and we had rounds of six-party talks. And then, as you know, when there was the Trump administration, the outreach to the Korean leader, and then where that led. Here, it's very concerning about the nuclear issue. It's very concerning about these test flights. In this case, for all of us, especially those in the region, but all of us. And the question is, how does one get one's arms around that? We've gone through 6-party talks and then leader-to-leader engagement. It's, I'd say, one of the areas that is the hardest to, in my book, in my view, hardest to define. I'll end on this note, and that is that I think when one steps back and then looks at the Middle East region, every single area is really afoot with conflict and tension. In the Middle East, Iran is certainly supported and backed by Russia. Russia also has a stronghold in Syria, and certainly during the past conflict, certainly was in the forefront of trying to maintain its base and its strategic assets there in Syria. And then strikingly, China released a number of years ago a statement about a Middle East plan, and in which China was looking at enhancing its own engagement here in terms of ports and port facilities in and throughout the Middle East, and not just only in the area of trade and engagement on trade, but also actually what would constitute really a strategic presence. So in sum, all of these areas are very much interrelated. It goes back to my first point, which is about great power competition, about China aligned with Russia against the United States and its allies and its partners and its friends, and in which we can expect to be confronted with this going forward. I will end there, but I'm very delighted to take questions, comments, and Dr. Kim, you asked me not to speak more than 20 minutes, and I think I met it
Very good.
precisely.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now,
Thanks.
before we getting into the Q&A, allow me to make a small comment. ICAS is not an agent of any foreign government and foreign principles. We are completely supported by voluntary contributions. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, now is Dan out there? Dan?
Hi, Dr. Kim.
Okay, go ahead, Dan.
Can you hear me? And thank you so much, Ambassador. So you've identified, I'm Dan, I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech studying grand strategy. And you've identified a number of potential hotspots around the world. And one gets the sense of just the sheer amount of difficult, complex problems the US is facing. I'm curious, how do you think about these problems? Because ideally we could address all of them equally, but with a limited pie, you have to prioritize. And so you've recognized that all these areas are interrelated with others, but I'm curious, how would you divide the pie in prioritizing what's happening in the Middle East versus, the Indo-Pacific versus Ukraine? I would appreciate your take on that.
I had put myself on mute for a moment. I do that just because, but I'm unmuted. You asked prioritization. Let me begin with this. I remember when I believe it was in the Obama administration, there was a kind of prioritization where it talked about pivot, if you recall, pivot to Asia. Personally, I'm not of a pivot school. I would say that I am of a school that you look at first and foremost how you establish your strength at home. And, there's been that term in the United States about America first. To me, America first, I never interpreted that as meaning isolationism. I look at, and I'm someone who, by the way, worked in the Reagan administration, and Reagan felt very strongly in that term, as we know, peace through strength. Reagan felt very strongly, first and foremost, that we need to have a strong military. In addition, we have to have a strong economy. So why am I mentioning this to you? Because you asked me to prioritize. I would say that all of these areas, we have to be very facile in dealing with all, in my book, at the same time. Does that mean dispatching troops and complete assets in one case or another? By the way, the United States does have military assets globally. We know that it has different military commands. There's CENTCOM in the Middle East, the Asia Pacific or Pacific Indo-Pacific Command. And then, of course, we have NATO and SACEUR. So in this case, by the way, we have military assets. We need to be very facile in being able to deter and look at very concrete and tangible ways of deterring. How can you best deter? Well, you can best deter when you show strength and resolve. In my view, one of the unfortunate developments was Afghanistan. With our withdrawal from Afghanistan, despite the very strong recommendations that were made by our Congress in a bipartisan way, to actually keep a residual, some 1,000 to 2,000, I believe it was, force in country, special forces, also to do it in tandem with other allies and friends in terms of having a presence. With that withdrawal, and then no less, the very unfortunate and egregious withdrawal. I say egregious because it was so, in terms of humanitarian, it was horrific watching what took place. It sent a signal. It sent a signal of weakness. It sent a signal of lack of leadership. So to answer your question, you asked about prioritization. Yes, you do have to prioritize because, different conflicts have different threat metrics. They have ebbs and flows. But right now, in terms of all three of these, the striking aspect is, by the way, in Ukraine and with Russia's invasion, the Ukrainians are fighting. And we provide aid and assistance to the Ukrainians, military assistance, as have many of you on this call. Secondly, when I look at Israel and what's happening in Gaza, by the way, they've asked for assistance, but who's in the forefront in fighting that? By the way, there is a kind of parallel there because Israel is looking at its own security and fighting and actually taking preemptive action. In the case of Asia, there we also have military assets on the ground. We have a number of bases, we have a number of carriers, and we also have exercises. As I mentioned, the Malabar exercises are not alone. That has a show of force. So I'm giving a broader answer to your question because to me, it's not a simple answer of saying, oh, it's this one over this one. It's your posture, which sends an important signal in terms of deterring conflict from breaking out, even when we're in a tense situation like this. But you also look at how do you help those that are also fighting, and how do you help those allies and partners on the ground immediately in this case. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thanks so much for your thoughtful view.
Thank
you.
Very good. Sean Creamer out there.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kim. Thanks for your comments tonight here, Madam Ambassador. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed your piece on your portion on the enhanced relationship that we're seeing with the authoritarians. And I just would like to get your personal opinion just about what are your thoughts of where this future collaboration is going to go. Just a lot of debate. I'm a retiring colonel. I've got about 120 days left on active duty. And so there's a lot of debate, even in my circles about where this is going to go. Do you think it is going to evolve into some type of a loose coalition akin to like what we saw with the Axis powers, kind of not maybe necessarily completely aligned, but, as you said, at least alignment of common goals and purpose? or will it turn into something more coordinated, like the Triple Alliance or something like that in World War I? Just would like your thoughts, just based off of your experience and what you and the team are talking there at both the Atlantic Council and elsewhere. Over.
All right, thank you. And by the way, my apologies. I cut myself out my video. I meant to cut my audio out. So forgive me while you were posing your question. So an excellent question. And there have been many who've been trying to analyze what direction this is going to take. From discussions I've been involved in, I haven't found anyone who has said that they think that this, and there have been different terms used. Terms ranging from, is it just a marriage of convenience between Russia and China, to others using alliance. I mean, actually, they've used the term alliance. I use the term alignment. And why? I do see it for the long term. I don't see it, as I said, for a short term. Why? Because I think it's in their mutual interests, quite frankly. I do think their strategic goals are very much aligned in terms of targeting the United States and targeting particularly our strong alliances that have even been proliferating more. It's not just only about NATO. I mean, the Chinese have not liked from day one the Quad, and also have not liked even the Quad expanding and even being elevated. The Biden administration elevated it to head of state. Trump before that elevated it to the ministerial level. So quite frankly, that also, it's been, you look at Chinese statements, press, there's been a condemnation of it. So first, to answer your question, I don't think it's a loose arrangement. I think that it has been benefiting both. I would say that, and I don't see that as shifting. Having said that, let me add two other dimensions. If you had asked me this question and we were together a number of years ago, quite frankly, I might have said to you that I felt that in the Arctic, they had different kinds of interests, and there's competition between the two of them. Why? Because actually the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu actually was on the record for making a statement earlier. This was, again, much earlier, where he was talking about governance and how only the Arctic countries of the Arctic Council, of which China is not part, it's an observer, but not a member of the council. And it was said only countries of the council should be able to govern and have that kind of, be in the front lines. And other countries that have secondary, tertiary interests, and they're not Arctic countries or Arctic nations, they shouldn't have that right. We've been witnessing that in recent times, actually, there's been heightened collaboration between Russia and China in the Arctic. And, when you look at economic and commercial terms, I mean, there is competition. The Russians care deeply about their coastline, of course, the Arctic coastline. The Chinese have been the ones that have had cutters that have been able to get through. They've been actually in the lead in that regard. And then you got us, the United States, that actually, I believe it's now, I feel silly saying, I think it's a 1.5 cutter. We have to rely, ice cutter, we have to rely, our Coast Guard, we don't have much of a capability. We have to rely on other partners and friends. And then you have the Russians building base. Then I believe there was even a kind of exercise of which actually the Chinese and the Russians engaged together. So there has been a shift. So I wanted to bring that into the mix. Finally, my last point for your question, at the back of my mind, though, is maybe why your question and why you're posing it and why we've been debating this question is because traditionally the relationship between Russia and China historically has never been a strong one. It's been a tense one. I think there's been animosity between the cultures, and there have been manifestations of that. I think also we have seen, as we know, all kinds of conflicts and tensions over decades, and different paths taken. And fundamentally, I mean, when Russia is cast as the junior partner, I don't know of any Russian analyst or official that likes that kind of characterization. It's resented. And so, by the way, there are manifestations against that. And I think that, well, I answered you. I see this in place for the long term for all the reasons I've stated, but will it be everlasting? Will there be a break? I would not rule that out. And that's just based on history.
Thank you. Sonny Lee? Sonny?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kim, and also thank you, Ambassador. There has been I'm based in Boston, Harvard University Asia Center. Ambassador, there has been some recent debates about the what does the end game of the U.S.-China rivalry will look like. You just described that we are living in a great power competition, and then I think it makes people there has been some question that then how does the great power competition ends? What does the end game look like? Thank you. I want to hear your personal views.
Sure, that's not an easy question to answer. Of course, it's there's some hypothetical base to it, but I will say this to you. I think the end game depends on what we do. The fact of the matter is, it's not something that's so elusive. So in this case, as I've tried to make the case in terms of our own military base, this means in terms of not just only what the United States invests, it invests in military hardware, but also in advanced technologies, because as we have witnessed, it's not just only about, as we've witnessed in Ukraine, conventional warfare, but it is truly about advanced technologies. It's also about another piece, and that other piece is also about disinformation strategies here. I'd like to believe that, countries, if given the opportunity, and the people and populations of countries that are under authoritarians and dictatorships, that if given the opportunity and the chance to grow, that they will be given that. So in this case, I think one has to look at not only what we do militarily, economically, and I say that because if I may mention, and I haven't mentioned in this exchange at all yet, that when I look at Latin America and Africa, but let's take Latin America, China is all throughout Latin America. And, when I speak to Latin American diplomats and others, they say, where is the United States? China is in there. They're in there for energy opportunities. They're in there not just building roads and hospitals, but they're in there for trade reasons. And for us, so my core answer to you is, it really does. The answer, how it ends, depends on us. I think we can be very influential. I think we can be very impactful. I think we can also be, if I could use that word, victorious, in the sense that if we are in a position of strength, militarily, economically, and also not complacent, but that we do have a strong alignment with other countries, with partners, friends. And let me add one other in the mix, because there's been great talk about this. And that is about the issue of as that term's used, the global South. To me, again, you can't just have us profess what we want to do vis-a-vis Latin America or what we want to do vis-a-vis Africa. We have to look for trade and economic opportunities. We have to look at ways in which we also assist and provide incentives for growth and advancement, and also provide assistance and support for particularly those countries that are looking for our support and that of others in terms of they're advancing their own political base and democratic values. So it's a broader answer to your question, but bottom line is, in my view, it does depend on us and what our policies are. Maybe
Thank
not
you.
completely, but I would say definitely strongly a good percentage of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Tong Kim out there?
Yeah,
Tong, go ahead.
okay. Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for doing this very comprehensive review of what's happening around the world, and not just in one region, but globally, like you once in charge of at the State Department, was Under Secretary for Global Affairs. Now, it's interesting that you covered two major areas, a hotspot now. There's Ukraine, hot wars going on, and Israel and Gaza is another area. You think how potential or relevance or possibility that North Korea might become number 3 hotspot?
I certainly did mention North Korea. I'm not sure if you heard me in my comments. I certainly would not say that it's number 3. I think it's, all of these are number 1, and that goes to the question before. They're all happening. I mean, I mentioned the fact that we had these 6-party talks for decades. We did not, and we were not able to reap results there. Then I mentioned during the Trump administration, he had a different approach. And, we know where and what that reaped. Basically, it is a hot spot. It's unpredictable. It's very concerning. There have been missile launches. So I unequivocally would say it is a hot spot and continues to remain it. But the biggest challenge there is there's such unpredictability and a difficulty in terms of having impact, in terms of a change of course of North Korean strategy.
Well, having listened to you, I was just wondering what else diplomacy can do anything about it, about the current situation in high level of insecurity, especially on both sides of the populations. They are really concerned than any time recently.
Well, the fact is, as we know, South Korea has tried diplomacy over, when I think back of number of its past leaders have tried to outreach and to engage diplomatically. We know that President Trump tried to reach out diplomatically. We know that there was even as I said, the 6-party talks, which was very specifically a diplomatic discourse. There's also been an attempt to try to push China to assist. I haven't, and maybe others on this call have. I haven't really seen some marked change or improvement, certainly not with regard to the issue of nuclear capability or an attempt to desist in its nuclear goals, objectives, or for that matter, in terms of the tragic living circumstances of North Koreans, and no less human rights. So tragically, I have not seen in my lifetime really what I would call some marked improvement in this case. Maybe what one could say is that the door has been more open than it was in the past, a meaning of entry there. But I don't think that has really resulted in some specific improvement on the ground and actual geopolitical shift on the ground in North Korea.
Thank you very much. David Lee.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Kim. Ambassador, I just had one quick question. I was hoping to get your thoughts on President Zelensky's recent comments on Ukraine pursuing nuclear weapons as an alternative to joining NATO. The unviability of that seems obvious, but I was hoping to pick your brain on how that process or deterrence of that process would even look, and how such a potential reality, or even the very fact that this is apparently a reality President Zelensky can imagine, could shape the already tumultuous region.
Well, I have sort of three comments on this. First, I think many of you would remember the Budapest Memorandum. The memorandum which Ukraine signed, which gave up its nuclear weapons. In return, at least Ukraine thought, for protection of its territorial integrity and sovereignty. And many Ukrainians over and over and over cite the Budapest Memorandum and that it was undermined and that the integrity of it was never upheld. And so now we are where we are. Ukraine has forged a number of bilateral agreements with countries looking at its way forward. You also know significantly that Ukraine also launched an attack on and has used long-range missiles attacking Russian territory. Why? Why? Because Ukraine clearly is posturing and basically, first of all, of course, it believes it has a right, it's been attacked, that it has a right to bring the war to Russian territory and to, if you will, the Russian population. That Russia should not be immune from an attack because Ukraine was attacked. But significantly, Zelensky is also looking at if there are negotiations that are held, take place, what posture can Zelensky have in order to be able to maneuver and have some leverage in any kind of potential negotiation? So in that case, I see that correlation. And that brings me to your question. I think he has raised this, again, looking at what his options are. And by the way, one is first, Zelensky was very clear that Ukraine does want to come into NATO. But by the way, on Article 5, it's an interesting point. Article 5 doesn't mean that immediately all the other countries have to place their assets or troops on Ukrainian territory. No, the issue is it is collective defense. You can determine in providing your support what is the kind of support that you'll render. Do you recall that when there was 9/11, by the way, Article 5 was invoked actually by NATO vis-a-vis the terrorist action against the United States? There wasn't a placement of troops. You look at what the actions are. So, number one, they've been very clear that they want to be members of NATO because to them, that is the strongest deterrent against future Russian aggression. And not just for Ukraine, but for the surrounding countries, the Baltic states, as well as for Poland, that are very concerned about any kind of future aggression. Secondly, in terms of also the issue of putting nuclear out there, it's again because of that correlation of if, and Ukrainians have said this, if they had those nuclear weapons, that would have been a deterrent that they could have used to forestall and to prevent any kind of Russian invasion. But the Budapest Memorandum, they willingly gave it up in good faith. So I see it as a kind of, if you will, reaction to Budapest and a reaction to where they are in NATO, and also an important leverage tool. And let me conclude in answering your question on this note. Many of you have seen, maybe you haven't seen, but interestingly enough, in this case, the Lithuanian Prime Minister, I was in Vilnius earlier in the year, and I was very struck by something that she said. She said, why in the West are we always putting down red lines for ourselves? She said, in this fight in Ukraine, I don't see that Moscow and President Putin is putting any red line down, but we're putting self-imposed red lines for ourselves. So this goes to the heart of your question in the context of leverage, maneuvering, posturing, deterrence, all of the above. That's the context in which I see his statement.
Thank you. Chung-Soo Lee.
Thank you, Madam
Go ahead.
Ambassador. You spoke about the show of force, and it's everyone will agree that for 30 years, United States, ever since World War II, U.S. had the preeminence in the show of force. And yet the result seems to be not so great a fruit. For example, Libya, Vietnam, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Gaza, the U.S. show of force did not result in peace in this area, but on the contrary, it seems to have provoked conflict in these areas. So, given the fact that the Iran was able to penetrate the Iron Dome defense and was able to land several missiles, with the 4 IDF soldiers recently being killed and 70 wounded, including 1 Israeli general. Isn't it time that we should set aside the diplomacy by show of force, but rather seek a true peace, because the bombs do not seem to work?
Well, I will say this to you. I am a believer in Reagan's statement of peace through strength. So if I conveyed to you that I'm about war, I'm not. I'm about deterring conflict at the best that one can. But you have mentioned cases of aggression, and where in terms of our own military prowess, it didn't deter it. By the way, there were also different types of war. I think what it also indicated that we were not facile or adaptive. As you especially were mentioning, you mentioned a variety. Let me focus on Vietnam. And I think one of the complexities, my own personal view of Vietnam, is that we were not well adapted to the kind of I'll use the word loosely, but guerrilla warfare, and in the jungle, and also in terms of American politics was very divided over this. It wasn't a very clear and concise and very specific action. It was, okay, we've done this, now let's pull back. Okay, now we've done this, now let's pull back. In other words, there was great inconsistency in my personal view in the way that was conducted, and we were not skilled in that type of warfare. What we are witnessing now, and I mentioned this in my own comments, that also I think that arena is really changing. There are advanced technologies. I think, when one looks at the kind of usage of drones and how drones have been used in the Ukrainian terrain, by the way, we're learning a lot. I don't want to say, there's definitely never a silver lining, if you will, in terms of this kind of bloodshed and loss of life. But if there is a silver lining to be had, it certainly would be that Ukraine would regain its territory, and that also we're learning a lot from what is taking place here. So to answer your question, I don't think that always it means that having a strong military necessarily equates with deterring conflict. Conflicts break out all across the globe. We are not involved in each and every conflict. But I do believe in peace through strength. I do think that peace is important, but I would not be like in the case with Ukraine, when you have a provocation and actually a blatant, not only provocation of a loss of territory, which does have ramifications, as I said, for Taiwan. I mentioned that earlier. But secondly, you also have a situation where the International Criminal Court, came forward and declared that there had been war crimes here. So it's a serious situation. I don't think one can walk away. Of course, one would want peace. Zelensky wants peace. And to the gentleman before, his question, David, I believe it was David Lee, his question, why is it that Zelensky's looking at all options? Because yes, he wants peace for his country, but he has to deploy the tools at his disposal. He tried, and let me summarize on this note, because you raised an interesting thing. I don't know if you know this, in the case with Russia and Ukraine, when Putin said to Ukraine, don't join NATO. By the way, Zelensky came back and said, we won't join NATO. He actually came back. And he also, his foreign minister and Lavrov, they met in Turkey. They were discussing the establishment of a humanitarian corridor, things like this. They were trying to, I think, look at what's a peaceful way forward, so there isn't such loss of life and destruction, massive destruction. By the way, in the end, there was never a humanitarian corridor that was established because it was never respected, bluntly speaking, on the Russian side. But most significantly, in this case, guess what happened on the NATO issue? After Zelensky said, we'll do this, then the Russian side came back and said, you have to codify it in your constitution that you will know never, ever actually become a member of NATO. And so Zelensky said, sorry, this is our sovereignty. This is our own constitution. You don't tell us what goes in our constitution. So forgive me for saying this, Peter, if I may, or Chong-Su, Peter Lee, in this case. Please, I think people do want peace, but, the question is, peace at what cost? And I think one has to use a military foundation in order to obtain peace. And that's where that term, the Reagan term, comes through, and that is peace through strength.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Nobuo, go ahead.
Tanaka-san, very nice to see you.
Nobuo.
Oh, thank you. Very good to see you, Paula. Very good statement. My question to you is that current U.S. election between Harris and Trump is very close race. So certainly there are countries or leaders who wants to influence the balance toward Trump. They are Putin, Netanyahu, and Kim Jong-un wants to see Trump be elected. So my question to you is, are they planning a kind of October surprise before the election? Much more strong attack from Russia to Ukraine on Kiev, or Israel attack on Iranian nuclear facility or oil facility, or Kim Jong-un in trying to some kind of very hard line attack on North Korea or missiles over Japan or whatever. Are there kind of real threat happening in the coming weeks? That is my question. And especially as an energy expert, I'm very concerned about the Hormuz Strait. If Iran attacks oil facility or nuclear facility, there could be a very big chance of blockade of Hormuz. That is a nightmare for me.
Well, you've painted a number of situations that could happen, whether the U.S. was having an election or not having an election. But your question was directly, is there a correlation and an attempt to influence? By the way, if you happen to notice, when Putin was in an interview and asked who he'd like to see win, I hope you remember, he said Harris. He said, you do remember. Okay, you're shaking your head. Yes. Okay. So I will simply say that I think that in the question of October surprise, I think that all of these players and these autocrats want to wreak havoc, but that's whether we're having our election or not. Full stop. I just think that you're going to see that kind of action. Whether it happens in October, not necessarily. But I think it would happen because even with, either in this case, I think that there will be an attempt to have a challenge. Now, as we know, during Trump's time, I think that when Trump got in, it's and has been said many times, is his actions have been a deterrent. But this goes back to Chung-Soo, Peter Lee's point when he asked and was asking about military. By the way, I will say this, Trump actually did invest in a strong military. There was a revisiting of what our assets are. So I look at that. It's not just only the leadership. And I think in that sense, that's where he had an edge and there was a strong deterrent. So in terms of influence, they like to have influence. That can happen at any moment.
Thank you.
Mike Franchik has his hand raised.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, right buttons. Ambassador, thank you very much. You made me look up what the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 said, so thank you there. That's a useful document to look at the precision of wording of how that's worded. The question I have, though, is currently there's two limited regional conflicts going on, one in Ukraine, one in the Middle East, of various levels, depends on who you listen to. But how do we use the whole of government to deter a conflict occurring in the Asia-Pacific region? And then how do we prevent escalation of any one of those two or a potential third conflict starting to expanding into a global conflict amongst all the adversaries that are listed in not only the U.S. national security strategy, but also the security strategies of our partners and allies across the world?
Well, first you asked me about the region of the Indo-Pacific. I think that I have made some points that already that relate to your question and what my answer would be. One is that you can't ignore one arena at the sake of another arena. When I was asked the question about priorities, to me, I mentioned that all of these are priorities in terms of the potential for either outbreak or ongoing conflict. So this brings me to the second, the importance of our alliances and the strength of our alliances. And toward this end, that's where I think for the Indo-Pacific and as a deterrent, I think, as you heard me before, cite the Japanese Prime Minister and his statements that we need to be vigilant about Ukraine. And Ukraine, it's to me not only about the Budapest Memorandum. I would have liked to have seen us get in long-range military equipment that the Ukrainians could use so they could defend themselves. They've been asking over and over for this in a timely way and in which they could use it. So what happens there, I think the Prime Minister is correct, does have ramifications for the Indo-Pacific. So what is the deterrent? Well, the deterrent to me is what we do in Ukraine and how we help Ukraine, at least at this moment. But that's not it alone. What also matters is in terms of our assets in the region. I think AUKUS and the AUKUS alliance is a crucial one. It's been an important development that has great deterrent value, as does the Quad itself. So I feel I feel I have addressed some of the ways in which we should be vigilant about the Indo-Pacific. We shouldn't be ignoring it, but we should be looking at how we strengthen our posture. And by the way, something I haven't said heretofore, I certainly did like the change that took place during Trump when it became, excuse me, the Indo-Pacific and the formal engagement of India in this. India certainly is a player that's well united in this context in terms of its concerns about China and Chinese aggression. And towards that end, its involvement is key. You asked about the global. Well, I go back to my core points before. I think that it's important for the United States in terms of its clear goals internationally, a clear leadership as to what we want to do, the alliances, because we can't do it alone, and in terms of having a strong military economic foundation. And part of that is also a strong political foundation. There were some that would argue that, in the aftermath of the Cold War, that we were rather complacent, that we very much sort of felt, hey, well, this says a new chapter and we're just going along, but how crucial it is for us to actually not be complacent. And I think all of these crises have demonstrated that we cannot not be complacent at all. And right up to, you've heard me mention the Arctic. I'm mentioning the Arctic because it's a place that actually gets so often overlooked. And there's been a lot going on up there in a military context. I hope that I've answered your question, but I'm building upon some things I have already said. I did see you had your hand up earlier, so I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but did I answer your question, Mike, or do you have a follow-up?
The part I was looking for, ma'am, is the whole of government approach. You mentioned earlier the
whole of government approach. Okay.
Roger. So in the DIME model, you mentioned the M, and I agree with what you're saying about the military function in the DIME. What about diplomacy, information, economic side? That's the piece I was wondering, how would you recommend our nation's leadership attack that?
Well, by the way, you're quite right to point out, and I didn't say that in my comments, a whole of government approach does matter. Because if I use the word loosely, when I use the word warfare is afoot in so many different spaces, and that's what you're saying. So we have to be really engaged on combating disinformation. There's been disinformation used in so many different ways that have had consequences. And let me give one quick example. The Russians used, and it was documented, social media to actually bring out protests and riots in Chile. And that literally sank a democratic government, I should say, when I say democratic government, a government that was really thriving. There was another government that came into place, but what happened was so starkly connected to these social riots. The government of Piñero at the time, and I repeat, it was documented. We are woefully not strong in this space. So you're correct to point out a whole of government approach. This is an area that we need to be stronger. A second is, I've mentioned technologies and the use of it and misuse of it. So this is also a space that I would say, I feel and I think that our Department of Defense, and from what I've seen by the recent strategy that they released, it's an area that they have documented and have indicated there's been greater attention drawn to it, which is absolutely key. I've already mentioned economic, and let me give a sidebar here. When Dr. Kim introduced me, when David Lee introduced me, he mentioned that I'm the chair of Exim Bank's Council on China Competition. I am indeed. And by the way, that's a tool and an instrument which, by the way, we've tried to push to have its greater integration in terms of a whole of government approach. It's not just only about military assets, you're quite right. You also have to have a strong economic base. You can't leave spaces like Latin America to others in terms of, the economic kind of trade and engagement. So those are all of the types of areas that I would say. And finally, I also think that we need to, if I use the political term, need to also engage on what are our values. I have heard often that there are those that would say, well, democracy is not delivering. And so, what does that mean? And how do you rectify that? And that's something that's important. And it relates to your question because it's not just only about a show of force as a deterrent, but it is also the kind of economic engagement. And by the way, if I could connect your question back to Chong-Su, because in this case, no, seriously, it is something, if one pursues and integrates those different elements, that also can certainly be invaluable for providing a foundation for peace.
Very good. Thank you. John Vischer out there? John?
He's there. He just waved.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
John, go ahead.
I served in the U.S. Navy in Asia for 28 years. So I'm kind of interested in how U.S. Navy port visits around Asia Pacific could help to challenge China.
Well, you know what? I will give my answer, but since you spent such a long time, I almost want to ask you, what's the answer to your question? Seriously, but let me give you at least my observation is it basically, it shows again, to use that term, a show of force, a presence. Presence matters in terms of that we are engaged. We're not over to the side. We care. We care about a region. We care about allies and those that we come into in terms of a port. It's about connectivity, but it's especially both, it has political and military value in a peaceful way by actually having that kind of presence. Would you agree, John? Because you've spent such a long period of time in Asia?
Yes, absolutely. For example, in particular in Cambodia, the Chinese have been trying to build up the port in Sihanoukville, but then I think maybe they're evacuating, and the United States Navy considering port visits. So, which is close to Thailand and Vietnam. So I know that I agree. I encourage more U.S. Navy port visits. Among most of the countries in Asia are opposed to the aggressive activity of China.
Well, and you raised an important point about port visits. If you may have heard me earlier, I mentioned that the Chinese did about a year or two ago release literally a strategy which they put out in the open about the Middle East. And in it also was about greater engagement. And by the way, the building of ports and the acquisition of ports is front and center. So it correlates very much with what you've said. Yes, if you're not present, you're not having any kind of connectivity or influence in any way, or you're not of any deterrent value.
Very good. Thank you, John.
I have a follow-up question. So actually, I was a Navy JAG lawyer. So as a private lawyer, Navy military retired lawyer, I'm helping many applicants for asylum from China who are extremely persecuted, and that's why they're fleeing China. So I wonder how the United States Department of State, I know, has, for example, interreligious freedom report and many other reports about the country conditions, which the immigration court judges who I present evidence to are very concerned with. So I know that under Ronald Reagan, when I visited as a student Moscow, Russia, the people in Russia were quite upset with their own government, and I think I see the same phenomena in China, North Korea, Russia. Now, I mean, the people are just so fed up with their own government. So how can we just show how our system of democracy and checks and balances allows more toleration for people to express themselves, for example, religiously, as Christians or any other kind of religious expression?
Well, first, let me just say, because you mentioned these reports, the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department issues annually the Human Rights Report. And yes, there is an Office of Religious Freedom. Actually, there's an ambassador. It's ambassadorial rank and a commission on religious freedom in which there are various testimonials. So just to point out a few in this case, and I'll even mention one more, there's an Office of Trafficking in Persons. And all of these areas are areas which the United States tries to spotlight. It gets that word out. I know that there are many dissidents who they like to and want to see these reports. There have been many of the past who have said that those reports have given them hope and have given them inspiration and enabled them to go on in very difficult times. Secondly, there are organizations that do engage and in different countries. I will say China is very restrictive, but having said this, I will also say that I am aware of those who are holding what would constitute sort of smaller schools and through education strive to actually have connectivity and outreach. During my time as Undersecretary of State, I also held two other hats. For the last 2 years, I was also the president's envoy to Northern Ireland. But for all 8 years, I had a different hat, and that was I ran the office or had oversight of the office of the Dalai Lama. And honestly, that was something that we worked on from day one. And we tried to engage in so many different ways. And by the way, John, if I may say, it's not just only through the United States. It's also through other countries. India is one of the countries very generous in terms of housing Tibetan refugees and many who've put their lives on the line coming across, literally across the Chinese terrain. So I just simply say there are also many organizations. I'll mention one too, if I can, because of this organization, ICAS. I happen to be also on a board. It's the Human Rights Committee in North Korea, and in which that group tracks North Korean defectors, dissidents, and works very, 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 very hard in terms of its outreach. So there are multiple ways, but you raise an important point, and reports are just one way, but there have been many other ways in which such outreach and engagement occurs.
Thank you very much. Sungjae Park from Seoul.
Yeah,
Go
yes. Well, actually, so finance is supposed to be very important for the Ukraine war. Is there any opportunity, NATO or European country can use Russians frozen money in Europe? So I understand like $300 billion.
Well, if I understand your question, let me say this is about using Russian assets.
Yes.
And the answer to that is yes. There have already been a number of countries, including the United States, although we don't have that portion. We just are supportive of the policy. But there are a number of European countries where there are Russian assets, and various parliaments have taken action in stating that those assets should be confiscated and turned over to Ukraine. The United States, this administration, and I believe it's a bipartisan support, actually does support these actions very much so, for all the obvious reasons. But reparations are very important here, and Ukrainians have welcomed it.
Thank you.
Yes, can I ask a question?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Dr. Kim. My name is Hee-jae Jung. I'm an undergrad student at Azusa Pacific University studying international relations. It is my honor to hear from you, and I would like to ask you about your view on South Korea's potential nuclearization. Is there any possibility that the newly elected US president allow South Korea to develop nuclear weapons? Thank you.
In terms of positions taken by either of the candidates, I will say admittedly, I honestly have not heard either state a specific position. So I'm sorry for that in this case. Clearly when the president was in town and met with Biden, Biden himself has spoken to this issue, and I think Korea has been very clear about its interest in protecting itself and its defense. But I'm sorry to say I have not heard candidate and Vice President Harris make a comment specifically. And on this topic, I haven't heard President Trump give a specific answer to it. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer for you on that. I just not have heard that as a debate or a discussion topic. But
Very
thank you.
good. Isaac Kim.
Question.
Isaac, you have a great opportunity to ask questions to the ambassador directly. Isaac, unmute your button. Isaac, go ahead. Isaac, go ahead.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Speak up.
Can everyone hear me or?
Yes, can hear you. I see you now, Isaac. Okay, you're right in the center of my screen.
Okay. I haven't exactly prepped for a question, but
may I ask you a question? Where are you? Where are you studying?
I'm a high school student in New Jersey.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
What are you studying?
I study high school courses, like everything. So
Are you interested in international politics?
Yes, I do read the newspaper sometimes, yeah.
Okay. Were you about to ask a question? I think first you said maybe not, but now maybe yes.
It might not be like the best question, apologize in advance, but like what made you choose this career?
No, I'm very glad you asked that question. And I've been asked it many times. So first, I had two parents. My father and my mother were both educators. And I grew up with them focusing not just only on the importance of education, number one, but also I happen to be, by the way, with my last name, I happen to be of Ukrainian descent. And so my parents instilled in me a love of culture and how important it is to be attached to your culture, to know your roots, to know, a bit about your history in that context. And so it's interesting. I'll tell you quite honestly, Isaac, originally I wanted to do pre-med at Georgetown. I was looking at a medical career. But my father and my sister said, no, at Georgetown, there's a School of Foreign Service and International Politics. And they convinced me that I should try my freshman year, try. So I did. And you know something? I never looked back. I never changed. I never went to biology, physics, and any of that. I went ahead and I never regretted it. I love actually being in this space. And even to add to that, and I'll say this to you, two things, because your question prompts it. When I was a junior in college, I went on a junior year abroad. I studied in the Netherlands. And then I worked at the US Embassy in Rome, Italy. And actually in Rome, Italy at the time, there were those coming from then the Soviet Union to Italy and to the United States, and others to Vienna and to Israel. So there was an immigration, and it was very much in my area, my interest. When I graduated from Georgetown, if I may say this, it was a difficult time for Korea, close to the year that I went, but it was in 1980, I went to Korea for the first time. Admittedly, there was martial law at the time. But I will tell you, it was a trip that was, for me, a trip of a lifetime. I was a student and I won an essay contest that was sponsored by a Korea foundation. And there were 5 of us. And that trip really also just, in my mind, just you absolutely solidified my interest in foreign policy. And that was my first trip to Asia, and I loved it. I loved it. I had been to Europe and then to Korea, and then where I went from Korea by myself to Japan, and then from Japan to Taiwan, and then I came home. So I'll say this first, I give credit to my parents. Then my father really encouraged me, School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And then my trips abroad actually opened my eyes, and I really felt very connected and engaged. So I hope you'll consider that. And in fact, if I may, that trip that I took, not only to Korea, not only did I eat a lot of great Korean food, which is I love very much, but I even learned a few words. Dr. Kim, I know 감사합니다 and
Very good.
안녕하십니까.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now, Jihe sir out there. Jihe. Esther?
Hello, can everyone
Go
hear
ahead.
me? Can everyone
Yes.
hear me all right? Okay.
Yes.
Let me get one more. I'm sorry, my camera was off because I have roommates and they had just left. So, hello. Hi, Ambassador. It's an honor to be here listening to you and to get the chance to be able to speak with you. My name is Jihei So. I'm currently a college freshman at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm looking to transfer next year to maybe the DC area. And I do have a question for you. I'm gonna try to word this as best as I possibly can, but I feel like, sorry, I'm a little sick. Right now, there is a lot on the media right now regarding, let's say, the election, the conflict with Israel and Gaza, Russia, Ukraine. There's just a lot of noise everywhere. And especially being on a college campus, I feel like a lot of students place a lot more emphasis on it. And there's a lot of misinformation that can also get carried around. And a lot of students may have a different mindset on what to think about some of these issues. And I just want some, like maybe a tip or some advice on how to drown out the noise around me and stay informed and stay on the right track, because I really do want to keep an open mind, but I don't want to be influenced by the things that the media puts out there to convince younger people like myself of something that isn't really true.
Well, I think that's, already by what you're saying demonstrates to me that you already have a real hold on yourself and in terms of your values and of what's important in your life and what you want and what you don't want. So I don't think I need to tell you to shut out. You already have. It's very clear that you have. I'd say join with those friends and individuals who undertake actions, community actions that benefit others, but don't engage in the spread of hate. One thing that I know has been terrible on many university campuses as a result of the Middle East has been, really action against an anti-Semitism, manifestations of anti-Semitism, and it's appalling. I mean, it's truly, truly appalling. I'm just giving one area. I mean, there have been many areas that one could speak to, but certainly this is one that's been very, very appalling. So I would just say to you, continue exactly what your instincts are. They're very noble. They're very principled. Stay the course and reach out for those like-minded people. So you form your own coalition, your own network, and engage in actions where you can ensure that you spread that same kind of upbeat, positive thinking that really combats what you're hearing. And finally, I'm the worst to recommend this to you, but today younger people are so skilled on social media. You could probably create your own podcast. You could probably create, a number of types of social media outlets where you put your voice forward and you put that of your friends and your coalition that you've established, and you have influence that way. Though that's the advice that I would give you.
Thank you so much. It's just that being in the area that I am in, I feel sometimes like I feel sometimes a little villainized for the things that I believe, or just even who I'm planning on voting for. It's very stigmatizing, and it's sometimes hard to get away from all of that.
Well, you know what? I'd say this: stand tall, hold your head up. You'll feel better in the long run that you're true to yourself and you're true to your own values and your own principles. And for those that tried to bring you down and malign you, they're not worth listening to, or you're having them as friends. Don't waste your time, but stay strong.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Well,
Absolutely.
thank you very much, Ambassador. Time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, time is up. Let's give Ambassador a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Paula,
Kim.
this is a wonderful evening. We'll get back to you.
All right. Well, thank you. And as I said
Very good.
before, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.